Thomas Sowell was born in North Carolina, and as a boy moved to New York. From high school in Harlem, he went to Harvard, where he took his first degree in economics. His second he took in Columbia, and his PhD at the University of Chicago. He went on to teach at UCLA, at Amherst, at Cornell, and since 1980 has resided as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. You once told me that in your early days at Harvard, you had a very dramatic personal travail. You were either going to make it or not going to make it.
Yes.
And you shut yourself up and made yourself make it.
Yes.
In the absence of which, you would have been very different today from an esteemed
absolutely.
scholar. Now, what was it that gave you that strength? Was it something that you generated? Was it self-generating? Or was it something that, a resource that you inherited, or something that came in through the capillaries of the people who surrounded you at Harvard?
Oh, I suspect that by the time I got there, I was fairly well formed. I was 25 years old as a sophomore transfer student. It's hard to know. There were all those factors there if I were to look back, and I'm not sure that I'd be the person with the objectivity to say. Certainly having been through adversity before was some help, because I can remember a number of times in life when I faced tough things and I said, for God's sakes, I spent two months at Paris Island.
What else is tough?
Yes, so you can't overcome that. I can remember once when I was dying to be a baseball player and I injured my right shoulder and I became left-handed for 2 years. So those things you draw upon later on. I think many people, in trying to insulate young people from adversity, insulate them from the things that give them strength.
Okay, well now let's move on to the political implications of some of these points. One of them is a continuing war by you against the notion that affirmative action helps people, right?
Yes, but it's more than that. It's really a re-examination of the whole set of underlying assumptions, not only behind this program, but about social thinking in general. One of the things I wanted to deal with in this book, and the reason it's an international perspective, is whether or not a group is in fact formed by the society around it, or whether in fact the group has its own pattern, which follows it wherever it goes. Many people who criticized some of my earlier writings said that I arbitrarily attributed to groups characteristics that were really a function of the world they lived in the United States. And so I then looked at groups in other countries, the Germans in Brazil and Australia and Russia, the Chinese and Indonesia in the United States, other countries, to see, do they in fact have their own pattern, or are they simply reflecting what's happened to them in that particular country? And what I found by and large was that they had their own pattern, that the Germans in Australia specialize in very much the same kind of occupations and industries with the same kinds of skills, with the same kinds of, quote, stereotypes, unquote, about them as to their frugality, their hard working, their thoroughness, their honesty, law-abiding, etc., that you find in the United States.
Well, but doesn't that contend a little bit with your notion that the culture is something you go piggyback on, for instance, when the Jews rose in their general level of IQ? Or is it a combination of bringing your own folkways, mores with you, but also getting on that which is dynamic in the culture you visit?
It's obviously both, as most things are in social causation. But many people came in when the Jews came in, and faced, for example, with the free public libraries, the free colleges of New York City, and so on. Many of these other groups never went near those things, or very seldom. Whereas the Jews, having a history in which learning had a certain place that it did not have in other cultures, it was like a gold mine to them. The minute they saw all of this, they seized upon it. At one time, not only were the Jews a majority at CCNY, they were 20% of the students at Fordham University, which is Catholic.
So that what you're saying is that there was something that catapulted them towards taking advantage of something that our culture provided.
Oh, absolutely.
Therefore, that permitted the ascendancy of their IQ.
Oh, yes.
Which would not have been the case if they had found themselves, say, in Brazil.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in Israel, I understand that the Sephardic Jews who have been in the Arab countries for centuries have lower IQs than the Ashkenazic Jews who have been in Europe and the United States for centuries. So clearly the society has its impact. But it's also true that there are people facing exactly the same situation. For example, youngsters sitting side by side in the same classroom from different groups, living in the same neighborhood, and yet the IQ differences that you'll see will be as large as those among blacks and whites going to school on the opposite sides of town in Mississippi in the Jim Crow era.
Well, now, Ms. Sowell, the scare word in any discussion of race is, of course, the word genetic.
Yes.
Because too often people are delighted to affirm genetic differences, which allow for superior and inferior races and so on and so forth. Now, how, in fact, is one to distinguish between that which is genetic and that which is so impacted culturally that it might almost have that effect? You speak about the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews, and continuing differentials notwithstanding that the melting pot in Israel is now 40 years old. How do you account for that? And do you run the danger of the word genetic being used metaphorically to mean also hard cultural insisted inclinations?
I guess that my emphasis would of course be on the cultural. The Sephardic Jews, for example, who came to the United States and did not have these centuries in the Arab countries, are not at any disadvantage vis-a-vis Ashkenazic Jews in the United States. I think that's probably true in places like Brazil or Curacao as well. So it would be cultural primarily, at least in my judgment. Now there are those who would attribute it to genetics. I had an argument with someone like that last week. The great problem is these things go so much together, that taking the black population of the Western Hemisphere, those blacks who have a higher percentage of white ancestry have had enormous social advantages historically. In the United States, when there was slavery, the overwhelming bulk of the slaves were black, but 37% of the free blacks were in fact mulattoes, which is in the American definition, half white or more. In Latin America, there are countries in which more than half of all the free blacks were in fact mulattoes, and in which the great majority of the slaves were black.
And advantages inured to them? Advantages inured to
Oh,
them?
absolutely, enormously. Well, freedom alone would be one big advantage. But even under slavery itself, there were distinctions made between the mulattoes and the blacks. The mulattoes being very often the offspring either of the slave owner or of the overseer, and therefore getting preferential treatment. And so throughout the Western Hemisphere, those people who have higher white ancestry among the black population have been economically, educationally, and otherwise more advanced. And in times past, it was quite common for them to attribute their success to genetics, when in fact they were fairly blatant historical differences. But the question is, how would you then separate out the two things, since they always occur together?
So that when Huey Newton went to Cuba and ended up complaining that all the privates were black and all the non-coms were mulattoes and all the generals were white, he was really making your point.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm amazed with all the way that the American performance in the Caribbean has been put under a microscope, that no one has noticed that those Cuban soldiers being brought back are black.
Yeah, right.
And those Cubans who are running the country are white, and the Cubans who are appearing on television defending their country are likewise white.
Well, now, I think people read your book incorrectly who come to the following conclusion, but let me, in any event, state the conclusions they come to. Namely, that you oppose efforts, political efforts, to give equal opportunity, which in fact you do not, correct?
Yes.
What you oppose, as I understand it, and as your book very plainly states, is any preferential treatment that disguises objective standards. Is that correct?
Yes, and particularly since the net effect of the preferential treatment, which is preferential in intention more so than in results, is that those blacks who are particularly disadvantaged have fallen further behind under these policies. That such policies have typically benefited those blacks who were well off, who became better off. And this is true also in other countries. In India, there's a program in Bombay, and someone who wrote about this commented that this program is for the benefit of the clerks, not the coolies. But that's been true in general, and that's what's true in the United States. that it's not the coolies that benefit, it's the clerks that benefit, who then aspire to higher occupations. For example, blacks who have relatively less work experience, lower levels of education, black female-headed families, all these groups have fallen further behind during a decade or more of affirmative action. Black female-headed families have had an absolute decline in real income over this span and have fallen further behind white female-headed families. At the same time, black couples who are both college educated earn higher incomes than white couples who are both college educated. So that this whole program makes it, provides incentives to hire blacks who are safe. Therefore, one will make some effort towards one's quota, but one will not take in people who might not progress enough for their promotions and discharge patterns to satisfy the government. So you make it risky to hire average blacks and more desirable to hire blacks who have not privileges, but advantages.
Well, now, do you ascribe to the programs of the past 10 years that polarization? Because if so, how does that account for the apparent correlation between those families, those black families that do not do well, and the vastly increased number of one-parent black families?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, during the past 10 years, we've had affirmative action. Mm-hmm. We have also had we've also had a rise of between 21 to 37% of families, black families, that have a single parent.
Yes.
I.e., there's been a desertion by the male,
mm-hmm.
by the father.
Yes.
Now, is that a part of the welfare program, or is that entirely coincidental? And to what extent is that the socially causative factor of the phenomenon you're describing?
Well, if I limit my description just to families that are female-headed, and I compare blacks and whites, then within that comparison, I see that the blacks are falling further and further behind. Yet if I pick almost any measure of more advantaged families, I find the blacks not only catching up, but in some cases overtaking and passing the whites. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of ways you can look at it and you get the same result. And what that suggests to me is that those blacks who have the skills, the experience, the education, and so on, are finding things much, much easier than ever before, whereas those where there's a risk involved in hiring them, that people aren't going to take that risk. I've seen her explain to me very explicitly in the case of women, and I suspected they wanted me to draw the same conclusion with respect to blacks. Universities have said, people at universities have said to me, we will not hire a woman who, for assistant professor, unless we're sure she's going to make an associate professor, because the cost of legal processes in case she doesn't is so high. I remember telling this to a woman who was a full professor to see what response I would get.
A black woman?
Black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And her response was, yes, that's the way I hire, because I also have no time to waste at the EOC and in the courtroom.
So therefore, they don't get the same running chance. The
That's
white
right.
students, the white.
If you're going to hire someone mediocre, the employers are safer hiring
mm-hmm.
mediocre whites who can be thrown out if they don't work out mm-hmm. without any repercussions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now let me ask you this: why, when we see on television and when we read the writings of the overwhelming number of acknowledged black leaders, is there no more thoughtful is no thoughtful attention given to such analyses as your own? Is it because they are simply wedded to the notion that there is a political solution, or is it because victimization is the easiest way for them to account for their plight? What is the dominant reason?
Well, both of them. Because clearly if there is no political solution, then what use are political leaders? People often emphasize to me the enormous importance of leadership for any ethnic group to get ahead. And my response is often, name me 3 Japanese American leaders. And no one has yet been able to do it. But so leadership itself, if you have the vision that I have, then leadership itself becomes much less important. And for a leader to say that leadership isn't important is like, a Cadillac saying it doesn't matter what car you buy.